Good morning, guys. We'll get started with our session. It'll be relatively quick. And so, what we'll be doing today is we'll be preparing you for the assessment that will be taking place this Friday on chapters 23 through 25. Let me bring you back, first of all, to your Google document so you guys can see what the plans are for today. We've done just fine for getting content done. My hope is that the work that we're doing currently is not causing you tons of problems at home. If it is, please let me know. But we've now studied chapters 23 through 25, taking a look at the post-war era through the 1960s and getting us through the civil rights movement, which we were working on yesterday together. This Friday, then, what we'll be doing is another short answer assessment where I'll be giving you short answer rights that we'll be passing through Turnitin to make sure that you're not plagiarizing, but you'll be using your notes, obviously, because we are definitely not going back to school until at least May 4th. The governor did not sound very optimistic yesterday about our plans to reunite even at that time. But he is getting messages from the president, including some states in the Deep South, most notably Georgia and South Carolina, that are opening quite a bit today, in spite of the fact that we're still seeing coronavirus exposures and infections rise. And so we don't have anything definitive as far as what the rest of the school year will look like. And so we'll continue with this same sort of strategy that on Friday, you'll be able to show me through your writing what it is that you are understanding from the content. And my hope that it will mean that assessment that we do on Friday should be something that you're going to find doable. When you guys are working your way through them, what I would encourage you to do, and this is something that is preparing for the next unit that we're moving into, in your Unit 8, Chapter 23 through 25 materials, you will find that there is a Unit 3 breakdown, and that Unit 3 breakdown looks like this. And so I want to give you some big ideas as far as what we should be taking away from the studying that you've done. And if you want to open this and make a copy and take notes on this, either now or else when you're watching this video coming up over the course of this week, you should be in good shape. We do want to notice that with Harry Truman and with Eisenhower, we are moving into a more conservative time period in U.S. history. After World War II is done, we have Harry Truman trying to create his fair deal, and Americans weren't super excited about doing that. But both he and Eisenhower were able to carry on the New Deal ideas. We don't get rid of Social Security. We don't get rid of the reforms that came during the Great Depression. And during the 1950s, we have a period of prosperity, especially for white Americans who are able to move to the suburbs, taking advantage of the automobile and new technologies like television, traveling freely on Eisenhower's interstate highway system. And we're going to find that during this time period, the goal is conformity. We have a number of people inside of our country who are worried about the rise of communism. And so as a result, there is a desire to conform during this period, which is known as the baby boom. There are many people who are worried about what's happening with the kids, and we see that happening in the 1960s. And so in the 1960s, we saw JFK become the president, and he was facing pushback, especially from conservatives like the Republicans and Southern Democrats who are nervous about big government programs. And in the Southern Democrats' case, the white Southern Democrats, they were worried about him taking action with civil rights. We learned that the Warren Court was very important during this time period because they were making a lot of decisions that were very much influencing the ability of people to retain their rights, whether it's Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, or else the Warren Court also getting involved in things like school prayer and other sorts of personal liberties where they were very strong on the idea that the government should not be forcing you to change your personal views or liberties based on outside influences. We are going to find that for Kennedy, he is going to be most known for his actions when he is working against communism. He is going to try to maintain containment. And you see that with his failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the rise of the Berlin Wall. And we're going to see that for JFK, that becomes his major element that he needs to focus on during his presidency. He is going to get assassinated, sadly, in 1963, and he is replaced by Lyndon Johnson. And what we want to be able to talk about is Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. And over here, you may want to put down the phrase war on poverty. He is going to declare war on poverty, arguing that the government went a certain distance with the New Deal, But he sees the Great Society as finishing the New Deal for Franklin Roosevelt and trying to create reforms to get rid of severe poverty for all Americans, but especially for African Americans who are very much at our poorest levels inside the United States. So he is going to create programs like Medicare to provide health insurance for old people, since old people typically would lose their insurance when they retired from their jobs. And that's when they precisely would need their health insurance. Medicaid is created during this time period, health insurance for poor people and people with disabilities. He is going to create things like public television, like we saw inside of our documentary. He is going to be creating a Head Start to try to provide education funding for kids so they're not behind when they enter into school. And an element of the Great Society that is going to be most notable is the element that's also woven through civil rights. But it's also the thing that's going to unite opponents who will transform into our modern Republican Party. There are the traditional Republicans who are nervous that the Great Society is expanding the government and could be seen as socialism or communism. There are some, though, who are worried about the fact that if we're helping out the poor, our poorest is going to be our African Americans. And so for white Southern Democrats, they're going to turn against the Democratic Party. Many of them will become Republicans then in favor of smaller government because of the gains that's made through the civil rights movement. So think about the videos that we were watching together. And we want to be able to think about the techniques that civil rights leaders were using to push back against segregation. So we learned about different groups. We learned about groups like the NAACP. And when we learned about the NAACP, they were the ones involved in court cases like Brown versus Topeka Board of Education to try to desegregate schools. We also learned about the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King and his effort with the Montgomery bus boycott that eventually became nonviolent protesting to try to force change inside the United States. We learned about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They initially got involved in sit-ins, and then they were involved in the Freedom Rides to try to put pressure on John F. Kennedy. And eventually, after there was violence and opposition in the Deep South, JFK was about to create the Civil Rights Act of 1963. When he was about to pass that, it got stalled in Congress. We had Martin Luther King's March on Washington in 1963, and eventually Lyndon Johnson is going to create the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that makes it illegal to discriminate based on race, ethnicity, and gender. We passed the Voting Rights Act after the horrible events that happened in Mississippi, including the Mississippi burning murders and also the protest that takes place at Selma that becomes known as Bloody Sunday. But we also discovered during our lessons that we had this week that we were wrestling with both legal segregation, de jure segregation, but then also we were wrestling with the fact that there were practices and habits, tendencies, and prejudices that weren't required by law. They were just the way that people had operated in the past. They were the structures of how we had built and sold our homes. And so we still have inside of our country nowadays legacies where you can easily see segregation and the elements of that still persist. We're going to find that in the late 1960s, many African Americans are going to find themselves frustrated by the fact that by getting rid of de jure segregation following these two laws, many African Americans are going to recognize there's still plenty of discrimination that's going on inside the United States that has not been resolved, and the momentum for the civil rights movement was starting to slow down. When Martin Luther King died in 1968, that signaled largely the end of the official civil rights movement pursuing the end of de jure segregation because of the fact that in 1968, we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that banned housing discrimination. So at that point, we had largely wiped off the books all of the laws that made it necessary for people to discriminate. But at that point, we still had all sorts of elements in our society that definitely showed that the relationship racially inside of our country still had things that we needed to work on. Now, if you take a look down this list, the nice thing is we're going to be testing on this on Friday. So on Friday, I'm going to be giving you a short answer essay test that will give you questions from each of these different time periods so you can show me how it is that you understood the stuff. The same requirements are going to be happening with that test where you're going to be asked to write multiple sentences on each of the questions to prove that you know what you're talking about. And especially if you are one of my kids who gets help from either John or Carrie or others, I'll be providing them with the test in advance so that they're able to see what questions you're going to be asked about. So you don't need to worry about a thing. You should be in good shape as long as you've been doing your work. Tomorrow, then, when we get back together at 10 a.m., what I'll be doing is I'll be starting you into chapter 29. Sorry, is that the right quote? I'm sorry, chapter 26. My fault. We'll be taking a look at the Vietnam War next. And what we'll do is we'll start off both tomorrow and the next day with any questions that you guys might need to have answered. We'll then study the Vietnam War because during Lyndon Johnson's time period, Lyndon Johnson wants to declare war on poverty and fix all these problems here at home. And that's going to be super expensive. But he's also going to get tied up in a war in Vietnam that's going to get more and more expensive. And he finds himself not being successful the way he wants to in both of the places. And since that time period, we've found that our politics has moved from Lyndon Johnson in a much more conservative direction because we've become kind of skeptical about the government being able to fix problems with huge sweeping programs. And we've also had a hangover effect where we've not really been certain about the idea of jumping into foreign wars as casually as we did with the Vietnam War itself. So I'm going to be checking my chat and I'll be checking my emails throughout the day. If you have any questions preparing for the test, definitely let me know. But like I mentioned, tomorrow is when we start moving into new material. Today, I want you to look over your review, make sure you're good, and let me know if there's anything you need fixed. If you don't have any questions, you can dip out. Just make sure that you fill out the attendance form for today to show that you have checked in with me, and we should be good. Have a good day, you guys.